A sharp, dry snap, like a bone breaking in silence, then another, and then the first burst. Valve number 3 exploded with the force of a hydraulic missile, striking one of the assistant technicians square in the head. His skull was crushed instantly, fragments and blood spraying across the curved cabin wall. A collective scream shattered the silence. Emily, the 10-year-old girl, covered her ears and fell to the floor. Jake Holloway stumbled backward, eyes wide in horror, vomiting onto his pristine white sneakers while his camera kept recording. Chaos formed in seconds. Peter Dorsey, one of the maintenance technicians, vanished into the rear corridors as if trying to erase himself. Carter Wynn, wrapped in an expensive suit and layers of pride, raised his voice with arrogance, attempting to seize control of the situation like a boardroom coup. Sarah Lynn, the mission's lead oceanographer, rushed to the containment panel, her hands trembling as she sealed the doors to compartment 3. Ethan Caldwell kept his eyes glued to the monitors, disbelief spreading across his face. The readings didn't make sense. The system was collapsing in real time. He scanned the internal logs and froze. The valves, they weren't the ones he had approved. His voice broke the thick air in a bitter whisper. He switched them. Another crack, sharper still. A treacherous fracture snaked through one of the front viewports, catching the light like a silent lightning bolt. The pressure of the ocean began to overpower the engineering, and muffled screams turned into full-blown panic. A woman ran toward the sealed viewport, her eyes begging for help, just moments before the structure gave way and imploded with a hollow roar. She was yanked off her feet like a paper doll. Blood splattered the ceiling. Carter fell back, wide-eyed, covered in what was left of her. Sparks burst from the control panels. A short circuit ignited the lateral compartment. Mike Tanner, broad-shouldered like the former Marine he was, grabbed a fire extinguisher alongside Luis Ramirez, the silent technician with a weathered face. Both charged into the flames on instinct alone. A third crew member tried to cross and collapsed, his clothes catching fire without a scream. The smell of burned flesh filled the air. At the center of the cabin, Eleanor James, the 80-year-old woman who moved with the calm of someone who had seen war, wrapped her arms around Emily, shielding her from the chaos. The little girl trembled, her face buried in the old woman's chest. The main light flickered one last time before going out. A deep shudder rippled through the hull. Total loss of propulsion. A dense silence fell, as if the ocean itself had held its breath. The Neptune Legacy began to descend, uncontrolled, unbraked, gravity pulling every bolt like a silent executioner. 100 meters down to the Atlantic floor, objects flew, bodies collided. A metal bar struck a crew member at the temple, the crack of a breaking neck. Red emergency lights flared to life. The alarm blared. Remaining oxygen, 72 hours. Sarah still worked to recalibrate the controls. Ethan stared at Nathan Blaylock, the CEO, now speechless, spineless, with nowhere left to hide. The arrogance was gone. Only the pallor of someone who finally grasped the cost of his emissions remained. Trapped, 3,800 meters below the surface, surrounded by silence and groaning steel. Mike watched each face, each breath, each absence. He thought of those still breathing. He thought of those already lost. He thought of his daughter waiting above for a father who might never return. And then he spoke, firm and low. "We don't have much time, and not everyone is getting out of here." The real battle had just begun. And perhaps, more than a fight for oxygen, an inner battle had begun as well. With each creak of the hull, it wasn't just metal that broke, it was pride, vanity, fear. Eleanor, her voice low but her soul unshaken, whispered to the child, "It's under pressure that the spirit reveals itself. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's the decision to face it." She knew what many had never learned, that sometimes the true rescue doesn't come from outside, but from what you find at the bottom, within yourself. There, where silence reigns and light cannot reach, stoicism became a compass, faith in invisible oxygen, and self-mastery the only hatch left. If you've come this far, it's because you felt the weight of this story as deeply as those trapped at the ocean's floor. To follow the next chapters in this journey of sacrifice, resilience, spirituality, and brutal revelations, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and share with someone who must not ignore what comes next. Because down there, truth is costly, and up here, your attention could save this mission. Long before the collapse, when the Neptune legacy was still docked under the spotlight of marketing campaigns, the idea seemed simple: turn a war artifact into a shrine of underwater tourism. Nathan Blaylock, a visionary to some and reckless to others, saw a gold mine in that steel carcass. He promised immersive experiences with privileged views of the Titanic wreck. The risks, he claimed, were mitigated by cutting-edge technology, but every improvement was in fact an invisible crack in the hull of safety. Ethan Caldwell had dedicated his life to naval engineering. When he was invited to oversee the project, he believed he was building a legacy. His name would be tied to the fusion of history and innovation. But trust began to fracture when meetings focused more on deadlines and profit than safety and precision. The original parts he meticulously specified were quietly replaced. He would only learn this in the descent. Sarah Lynn joined the mission as a scientist. She believed in the educational value of the project. She thought access to the Titanic could inspire new generations to respect history and the ocean. Reality would strike her harder than the deep. Jake Holloway had nothing of a researcher. He was a failed influencer, drowning in debt, desperate for attention. He secured a spot through lies and a fabricated profile. He planned to turn the dive into viral content. He didn't know his own despair would be captured in his final broadcast. Carter Wynn didn't seek beauty or truth. He was there because he could be, because money buys everything, even the right to admire another's tragedy. He didn't understand the ocean's depths, nor did he realize that down there, money doesn't float. Emily Hargrove had won her place in a school contest. She was accompanied by her uncle, a passionate historian. He would be one of the first to die, and she, the youngest aboard, would inherit a silence of grief, with a maturity life had never had time to teach her. Eleanor James wasn't a prop in the expedition. A former war nurse, she watched everything with trained, albeit slow, eyes. No one asked her anything, yet she heard the most. She already knew the smell of fear and the taste of regret. And Mike Tanner, the silent man with a steady gaze, was invited as a public image of military support. He accepted because he needed the money, but when the steel groaned, he was the first to move. Not for glory, for survival. All of them, with different stories and intentions, had descended believing they'd witness the past. No one imagined they'd be trapped within it. The silence that followed the collapse was more than the absence of sound. It was the presence of fear, as tangible as the cold rising through the steel frame. Sarah mentally mapped out the compartments, trying to understand what still worked. Mike silently counted survivors. Ethan still stared at Nathan, but the judgment in his gaze had given way to a kind of technical mourning, the bitter acknowledgement that it was too late. Emily asked in a small voice if they would get out. No adult replied. Eleanor, still holding the girl, answered with another question. Do you know what faith is? Oh dear, the child shook her head. Eleanor smiled, and even in shadow she seemed to glow. Faith is believing there's a way, even when we can't see the door. And courage is walking toward it anyway. Peter reappeared from the submarine's rear, his face pale as chalk, reporting that part of the air purification system was compromised. Carter asked, unable to hide his panic, how much time they had. Luis flatly said, if we don't act, maybe less than 48 hours. Then came the first forbidden question. What if there was only enough oxygen for some? Mike felt the shift in the air, not just from rising CO2, but from something even more toxic. The human ego in crisis. Jake, his camera still trembling in his hands, mumbled that everything was being documented. Carter demanded he shut it off. Sarah tried to intervene, but voices rose, and then hands. Ethan stepped between them. Eleanor simply watched. We're not the first to face death, she said calmly, to no one in particular, but we can be the first to do it with dignity. That phrase hung in the air, heavy but necessary. It wasn't a sermon, it was a reminder that down here, under tons of water, surrounded by history and their own reflections. Each would have to decide not just how to survive, but who they wished to be in doing so. Minutes later, the timer was activated. A small digital display showed the remaining oxygen time with cruel precision: 70 hours and 43 minutes. Ethan, hands steady despite the chaos, gathered environmental data while Sarah assessed the integrity of the compartments. Mike divided the space into safety zones, trying to maintain collective calm. On the support ship above, the crew began noticing the communication failure. Attempts to reach them via pulse radio and sonar received no response. Tension slowly built among the operators until the first confirmed signal failure alarm went off. Their clock, too, had started ticking. Inside the submarine, Carter Wynne broke the silence with a sinister offer. He would pay a fortune to the family of anyone willing to give up their spot in a potential escape capsule. Jake looked at him as if he'd received a divine invitation. His eyes sparkled, but his soul wavered. Luis crossed his arms without a word. Eleanor simply closed her eyes. Wealth is like air trapped in a punctured lung, useless when the heart stops beating, she murmured. Her voice pierced the steel like a prayer. Across the ocean, operators rushed to prepare a rescue prototype, a smaller experimental submersible capable of reaching extreme depths. The only question was when and if it would arrive in time. With 69 hours and 12 minutes remaining, the tension inside the Neptune Legacy began to change texture. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was calculation. Ethan informed that CO2 levels were rising past the safety limit. Movement was rationed. Breaths became quieter. Silence grew louder. In that new silence, Eleanor rose slowly and walked over to Jake, who trembled, torn between taking Carter's offer or exposing it all. Do you want to be remembered as someone who profited from fear, or as someone who was brave, even without an audience? She asked. Jake didn't respond, but for the first time, he turned off the camera. Mike and Sarah were at the rear panel discussing the possibility of manually repairing the auxiliary propulsion system. It was risky, but they might be able to reposition the submarine to a more accessible spot for rescue. Luis volunteered without hesitation. If someone's going up, let it be someone who matters. No one objected. Quiet bravery had become the new form of authority. Meanwhile, Peter rummaged through the supply compartment looking for something to protect himself or escape. He avoided eye contact. Panic now disguised itself as productivity. Carter, on the other hand, was unraveling. His promises of wealth sounded more pathetic with each passing minute. Money had lost its value. Air was the new gold. Sarah wrote on a plastic panel with a permanent marker. Objective: keep alive until 48H. Turning point: 36. Last attempt: 24. It was more than a plan. It was a structured prayer. Eleanor read it and whispered, "Discipline is a form of faith. Expect the worst, act for the best. You've already won half the battle." With 66 hours remaining, the first quiet death struck the group. One of the survivors, in a state of shock since the collapse, passed away in his sleep. No one noticed until his cold body was found during a head count. Sarah covered him with a thermal sheet. Emily asked if he was dreaming. Eleanor replied, maybe he dreamed his way out. Sometimes death is just a change in hatch. The phrase settled over them like a veil. Jake wept silently, hiding his face in his knees. Carter seized the moment, again pressing Luis to accept his offer, claiming that his daughter back in the US would have her life changed forever with the promised fortune. Luis didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the metal bar beside him. Mike gathered everyone in the cabin center. If anyone here still thinks they'll make it out alone, give up now. The only chance we have is if we think like a unit. Someone will have to go outside and try to reboot the antenna. It'll take courage, maybe sacrifice. Peter began backing away, muttering about an old shoulder injury. Carter said nothing. Jake raised his hand, but his eyes didn't hold the conviction. Luis touched his shoulder. You'll help, just not yet. He was the one who suited up. The gear he wore was experimental, built to withstand extreme pressure and fitted with autonomous environmental recalibration sensors. A marvel of contemporary engineering, but at that depth, no gear is invincible. Ethan handed him the cylinder. Sarah opened the hatch. Before leaving, Luis looked at Eleanor. She said only, "Bravery doesn't make noise. Go with God." The hatch sealed. Silence returned, and with it the wait for an impossible sound. A return. He didn't come back. Hours later, as time bent around them, the monitoring system flagged a total failure of the external antenna. Luis's mission had ended without glory, without sound, without signal. Sarah buried her face in her hands. Emily asked where he went. Eleanor, steady as ever, replied, "He didn't get lost. He gave himself." There's an eternity between those two things. Luis didn't just die. He chose to vanish for the sake of others, and that choice was bigger than any body. Carter, driven by desperation rather than reason, began building a solo escape pod with sealed tanks. When Peter refused to help, Carter threatened him. Ethan stepped in. In the scuffle, Carter slipped and fell onto a misaligned valve, triggering a lethal pressure discharge. His body slammed into the wall. Death was instant, but the silence that followed lasted longer than any scream. Peter, in shock, ran to the submarine's rear, locking himself in a compartment. Hours later, they found him unconscious from lack of oxygen. Mike and Ethan tried to revive him, but it was too late. Panic had claimed him before the ocean could. With 48 hours remaining, Eleanor, feeling her strength fading, called Sarah. She handed her a note for her family, should Sarah survive. Then she sat with Emily, told one last story, and, as if knowing the exact moment, closed her eyes for the final time. When the rescue submarine finally descended, only 3 living souls awaited the capsule: Mike, Sarah, and Emily. Their hands were joined. Eyes red, mission accomplished, not of rescue but of humanity. Ascent wasn't peaceful. As the capsule began to rise, a sudden vibration swept its frame, an abnormal tremor. Interior temperature fluctuated. Mike tightened his grip on Emily. Sarah checked the panel. A partial pressurization failure was forcing an emergency recalibration. They were ascending, but the system risked locking up. Above, a storm brewed. Waves 4 meters high battered the support vessel. Communications dropped. The lead operator muttered, "Not now. Please, not now." Inside the capsule, lights failed for 5 eternal seconds. Emily held Mike's hand. Sarah closed her eyes. Tension was absolute. Then, with a lurch, the system stabilized. Final ascent began. They surfaced into a storm. Rain, shouts, ropes thrown, shaking hands pulled them aboard. No applause, only tears. During decompression, memories returned in waves. Eleanor's words echoed like a secular prayer. "Courage is not the absence of fear, it's the decision to face it." Mike saw Luis's face. Sarah clutched the folded note. Emily, without knowing why, smiled. They had survived. But survival wasn't just breathing. It was remembering, living for those who hadn't returned. And that, more than air, was what truly mattered. If this story moved something inside you, if you held your breath, felt despair, or sensed the pulse of courage, then you understand that survival is not a physical act. It's a decision, the choice to face darkness with your eyes open, to not give up, even when everything seems sunk. Mike, Sarah, and Emily didn't return the same. They came back transformed. And maybe you can come out of this different too. If you believe in the power of resilience, redemption, and the human spirit, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that even in the deepest depths, there is still light.